Good afternoon. This is John Bushka from um, from Falls Church, Virginia again. I want to talk today about an issue about the progress of my screenplay that's being written by a third party. This is a picture of the Wren building from the courtyard in Williamsburg, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And I want to go to my little script, and I'll turn on my image. This, what I'm getting is a third-party perspective on how my book reports on the college expulsion for admitting homosexuality in 1961. As part of the treatment of the screenplay, we're getting another screenplay professionally written, and with the treatment, there's a treatment of the first chapter, and then the screenplay is supposed to be 3 of the chapters. And it's similar to one I've already written, but they're taking a little bit different track on it than I did. So we'll have 3 different possible ways of pitching the book to the movies after we have a professionally written screenplay, and I have paid for it. It's very interesting to me to look at this particular screenwriter's take on my demeanor when I was at William and Mary in the fall of 1961, based on the account I give in my book, particularly the first chapter of my first Do Ask, Do Tell book. Again, I probably, should have brought that up before I started this. But that's this one that I've been showing you a lot right here. This one. And it's a little bit tricky. Well, it doesn't seem to want to let me show my picture and look at this at the same time right now. It's very interesting to see how my actions were interpreted by this particular writer. And so here are some of the postulates that I'm going into this argument with. Men have a natural duty to protect women and children, even if they never have the opportunity for sex themselves or having their own families. In other words, they can be drafted into war before they have a chance to do that. I mean, that was the way it was in 1961, and of course we've had the Vietnam War since. Separately, men have a responsibility for children they father once they choose to have sex. In other words, once they become sexually active. I'm talking about young men, straight heterosexual young men who behave more or less the way that was expected at the time. But before before all these, long before Stonewall and long before other sexual revolutions. In fact, in 1961, we didn't even have Griswold versus Connecticut yet. We had the pill, but we didn't have the constitutional protection of it until 1962 of contraception, and that had a tremendous effect on triggering the sexual revolution. That might even have contributed indirectly to Stonewall. Men also normally have understood they have a responsibility to carry on the family lineage, at least by supporting others who do have children in their tribe, in their family, if somehow they themselves don't marry and have children. They're over in the 90s, 20 or 30 years ago, we used to hear a lot about the marriage penalty and the tax code, and it was common for people with families to have a lot more debt. They needed a lot bigger houses than single people did. And many of them were professional gay men then, long before we had gay marriage. And even before we overturned Don't Ask, Don't Tell. it was common for relatively gay men to be relatively well off financially because they didn't have as many debts or responsibilities. Particularly in the 80s and 90s, and the 80s, as AIDS became less acute in the 90s and the 2000s and so forth. Now, heterosexual men, and that's most men, normally have an instinct to have intercourse with women. And my father used to say this. He used to say, when blue eyes confuse you. I know that sounds a bit racist or something, but he used to say that it was instinctive for him. And there are medical studies that sort of bear this out. Men tended to believe that the idea that only people should only have sex when they're married created a hypocritical double standard. And you weren't even supposed to masturbate. You weren't even supposed to have fantasies until you were married. That was the most rigid religious standard back then. And of course, that wasn't very realistic. Now we changed direction in these postulates. In the 1960s, young men were being taught that they had to do well in school to have good lives as adults. I should have said school there. I don't know why I didn't. They had to do well in society, but I meant to say they had to do well in school and make good grades in order to have good lives as adults. And at the time, in the early 60s, racial integration was just starting. Brown versus Board of Education had been ruled in 1954, and it was only very slowly, supposedly with all deliberate speed, starting to happen. But generally, my background was around mostly white students, and that's the way it was. Before I graduated from high school, there had been very little progress in that. To be respected, however, you needed to do the physical stuff as well as get good grades. But getting good grades, doing well on tests, getting the term papers done, doing well in your finals at the end of the year in high school, getting to college, and then not flunking out of college, all this was very important then. And that was kind of the environment. I was getting good grades at William and Mary as a freshman. I had all A's at the midterms, which my roommate did not. And I was doing that part of it. But to be respected, young men had to do the physical stuff too. Which I didn't do very well. I didn't even swim. I had to learn to swim in college. I somehow got through. Well, I got through that at GW. That's right. Later. So I wanted to upwardly affiliate with young men who are both smart and strong. The teenage Clark Kent types like Smallville. And I thought this pattern of personality emphasis would promote virtue and promote people being better. But actually, it kind of promotes exclusion, as you see. If it scales, and if a lot of people adopt that attitude, it could backfire and promote an exclusive society that could turn fascist. So you can see why my attitude, if scaled, among a lot of men, would possibly endanger political stability. I was also concerned that somebody that I idolized, I broke the first of the 10 Commandments, let's put it that way. I was concerned that an idol could lose his advantages and no longer be interesting to me or to matter if if he had some kind of misfortune. It could be a disease, it could be going bald from chemotherapy, it could be maimed or disfigured, and particularly going to war, getting drafted and going to war. And so then I would never be interested. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody that I socialized with and who mattered socially I was attracted to. It doesn't mean that I needed to feel that way. My father one time asked me that, and I said, no, that was not true. But I needed to feel that way about one or two people in my life and have confidence in that feeling for everything else to work. That's an important point, that it wasn't everybody, but I needed to have that going on. And then once it was going on, I would become concerned that something would happen to that person, and I would be concerned that I would no longer be interested in the person because something had happened. And we'll see how this comes up again in a minute. If I didn't improve physically in doing the things young men were expected to do, then I would be regarded as a mooch. And I would leave the risk-taking and sometimes the necessary fighting, the draft, going to war and so forth, to cover for me. So because of this, I was teased and mildly bullied and so forth, and that's covered in the book, although not as bad as some people. The music and the piano lessons, helped get me some recognition. But I tended to be rude in class, and in the elementary grades, that was a problem, by interrupting in class and drawing attention to myself and what I had to say. And I started, breaking that habit as I got closer to puberty. That started to improve. And puberty was actually very beneficial to me, and that's something you have to remember today with what's going on. But in fact, in the summer after ninth grade, I see the sheet of paper here. The summer after ninth grade is when I organized an individual softball league where we played individual softball games with one-man teams. I made it, and it actually worked out pretty well. Because the scores of the games that we got were reasonably close to what you would get in professional baseball. That was something I did, and I even typed a little newsletter. It was kind of like a blog, and typed it in carbon and gave it out, around the neighborhood back in the summer of 1958. Now I noticed men's bodies more and when I didn't pay attention to women, but and the curiosity led to erotic fantasy and dreams and so forth. There was no specific warning to me when I was younger that if the curiosity leads to eroticizing fantasies, then I would risk exposing my limitations and possibly risk total ruin. That's something that the screenwriter said very explicitly in the treatment, that it was eroticizing the fantasies was what created the risk of accidentally exposing my weaknesses and possibly leading to total ruin. And that's kind of what happened over the course of the 11 weeks I was at William & Mary. I could get a rise out of other people who would tease me by noticing their own deficiencies in sexual attractiveness. Remember, particularly their lack of desirable secondary sexual characteristics. And my roommate was pretty much average in appearance, but some of the people in the dorm, when we had at night or something, who teased me the most were very unattractive themselves. One guy particularly was very obese, but yet was very insistent on claiming that he could get girls, even though he was unattractive. And young men at that time did not want to be expected to be attractive. They wanted women to be expected to be attractive, but some of them did not want men to be judged on sexual attractiveness, because that worked to their disadvantage. They would not be able to find partners if that was expected of them. And so if somebody was around judging them, kind of like I was, that could make them very uneasy. And that leads to the issue of the tribunals, which supposedly happened the second Friday of classes, and would have been September 29th, 1961. There was a ritual in which at least one or more boys who were targeted had their legs shaved. And the whole idea is that you give up some of your attractiveness, and you still have confidence that you can perform as a man and have a family someday. You can get over the superficial things and still perform the way society expects you to. And again, the screenwriter seemed to get the point of that in the treatment. So the conclusion of all this, which is rather disturbing, was that the conclusion of this, and this is what the screenwriter said, the therapist thought, and I guess it's true. They thought that I didn't feel sexual attraction for females, or didn't have the instinct, the instinct to desire them, or even respond to pornography, or respond to Playboy or something. And there was some of that in the dorm. I didn't, because I was too self-centered. In other words, I was ironically too narcissistic. And in fact, later on at NIH, the diagnosis that I would have would be schizoid personality and compulsive personality in two different forms. But the overall take on this is that the absence of normal sexual interest itself can become an issue. Now, we all know that modern theories about homosexuality include the fact that latter sons other than the first son, sons born later in a mother's pregnancy, are more likely to be gay, and there's a theory that seems pretty well founded that the mother's immune system may interfere with masculinizing the brain with androgens. The body grows up to be perfectly masculine and is capable of physical strength normally as anyone else's, but the person's interests change. But another reason could be that, older children, for example, the oldest child usually winds up taking care of siblings, and the youngest child, the youngest son, is taken care of. If you have to take care of younger brothers and sisters, you're probably more likely to value the idea of creating lineage yourself. I didn't have any interest in any investment in my mind in the idea that if I had children, I was in a sense propagating myself in some sort of vicarious immortality through a lineage, which was a very important idea for most people. At one time, my parents, in fact, back in when I was in 4th grade, they said they were considering adopting a child so I'd have a sibling. And they were considering adopting a girl, which didn't make sense because if we only had one bedroom for me with a twin bed, it would have made more sense to adopt a boy. Unless you did renovations in the house and turned the den into another bedroom. The den was my father's office, so I don't know what they were thinking of doing exactly about that. Maybe they thought they could build on to the house. That's kind of interesting. But then they never mentioned it again. That would have been like in 1954, 3 or 54, something like that. But anyway, this was the take on this treatment written by a third-party person. Really, the person was quite on the mark and making some observations that people are very uncomfortable discussing today. One of the things about male sexual attractiveness, of course, is that white men, for example, typically may have more body hair than people of other races because they evolved largely because they evolved in colder climates than most other peoples in the world did, and that may affect what the attitudes are about what a man's appearance is. In some cultures, it doesn't matter. In warm climates, it doesn't matter like it might matter in colder climates, where you only see what somebody looks like very occasionally. You don't see them all the time. So you may build up more of an interest in what the person looks like, and it may contribute to the idea that sexual secondary characteristics matter in some ethnicities, but don't matter in others. And I've always thought that was interesting. It isn't talked about very much because it would be a very divisive topic, but I think it, again, is something we need to be able to face. But that's kind of what I have today. Here's another picture of the Brown Hall porch. Just wanted to show that again, and maybe the other view of it. And that's kind of what I have today. And I thank you for listening.